Imagine a world where the color of your skin doesn't determine your opportunities or experiences. Does this world exist in America today? Welcome to our journey where we explore the intricate web of racism in America. We'll be delving into the historical context, the present reality, personal experiences, systemic issues, societal impacts, and the path forward. This exploration is not just an academic exercise, but a call to awareness, understanding, and action. Let us delve deeper into this complex issue. To understand racism, we must first trace its roots in American history. The story of racism in America dates back to the 16th century with the arrival of the Europeans. They brought with them a deep-seated belief in their superiority, which they used as a justification for the subjugation and oppression of the native peoples they encountered. This sense of superiority was further entrenched with the introduction of African slavery in the 17th century. Fast forward to the 19th century, America found itself in a civil war, split between the North and the South, largely over the issue of slavery. The South, largely agrarian and dependent on slave labor, fought to maintain the status quo. The North, on the other hand, sought to abolish slavery and in the end emerged victorious. Yet, the end of slavery did not mark the end of racism. Instead, it took on a new form: segregation. Laws, known as the Jim Crow laws, were enacted in the South, enforcing racial segregation in public and private spaces. These laws were a stark reminder that despite the abolition of slavery, Black people were still not seen as equals. The 20th century saw the rise of the civil rights movement. This was a nationwide struggle, led primarily by African Americans, to end racial discrimination and gain equal rights under the law. It was a long, hard struggle, marked by protests, marches, sit-ins, and even violence. Yet, it led to significant changes, such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. As we look back, we can see that racism in America has deep roots, shaped by centuries of oppression and discrimination. It's a complex systemic issue that has evolved over time, yet remains deeply ingrained in American society. This historical context sets the stage for the racism we see today. Despite the progress made, racism still persists in many aspects of American life. Let's delve into the current state of racism in America. It's a topic that's no stranger to our society, and yet it's one that's often brushed under the rug. Let's pull back that rug and examine the dust that's been collecting. In the realm of education, children of color are still facing significant barriers. It's not just about the achievement gap, it's about the opportunity gap. Schools in predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods often lack the resources and funding to provide quality education, creating a cycle of disadvantage that's difficult to break. Then, there's the employment sector. Despite laws against discrimination, people of color find it harder to get jobs, and when they do, they're often paid less than their white counterparts for the same work. This income inequality contributes to a wealth gap that's stark and unsettling. Next up, law enforcement. The relationship between people of color and the police has always been fraught with tension. Unarmed Black men are disproportionately targeted and killed by police. The fear and mistrust is palpable, with stories of racial profiling and excessive force making headlines time and time again. Healthcare, housing, the judicial system, the list goes on. In each of these areas, we see the same pattern of systemic racism. It's not just about individual acts of prejudice, it's about how our institutions, our policies, and our societal norms perpetuate racial disparities. But it's not all doom and gloom. There are individuals, communities, and organizations fighting for change every day. They're pushing for equitable policies, cultivating inclusive environments, and challenging the status quo. Their work is proof that we can confront and dismantle these systemic issues. However, it's important to remember that the fight against racism is far from over. It's a long and winding road, filled with obstacles and setbacks. But with determination and solidarity, we can continue to move forward. These realities paint a grim picture of the state of racism in America. But remember, it's a picture we have the power to change. Racism is not just a societal issue, it's a deeply personal one. Let's bring the narrative closer to home, to our individual lives. Take a moment to reflect upon your own experiences. Now let's delve into mine. The white voice you've been hearing? That's me, a woman who has spent her life in an environment of privilege. I've never been followed around a store, suspicious eyes tracking my every move, simply because of the color of my skin. I've not been stopped by law enforcement, a knot of dread in my stomach wondering if my skin tone makes me a target. But this reality isn't universal. Now let's hear from my counterpart, the black voice that has been interlacing with mine throughout this narrative. Growing up black in America, my experiences have been starkly different. I've often felt the sting of suspicion in public spaces, seen the fear in people's eyes, and felt the weight of prejudice on my shoulders. I've been pulled over by the police more times than I can count, not because I was speeding or breaking any laws, but simply because I happened to be a black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. Our stories, though lived within the same nation under the same flag, are worlds apart. This contrast isn't meant to induce guilt or victimhood, but rather to highlight the diverse realities that coexist within the same geographic boundaries. It's about understanding that the experiences of your neighbors, colleagues, and friends may be far removed from your own. Racism isn't just about the overt acts of discrimination we see on the news. It's also about the subtle, everyday instances of bias that people of color experience. It's about the discomfort that arises from being the only person of color in a room, the fear of being treated differently because of your appearance, and the frustration of constantly having to prove your worth. These personal experiences provide a glimpse into the lived realities of racism. Racism isn't just about individual prejudice, it's a systemic issue. It's like a deep-rooted tree, its branches reaching out into every corner of society, casting a long and oppressive shadow. This tree is watered by the systemic nature of racism, which includes two primary elements: institutional racism and structural racism. Institutional racism is when an organization's practices, policies, or procedures result in certain racial groups being disadvantaged. It's like a machine, operating in a way that consistently produces an outcome favoring one group over another. An example could be a company that, due to its hiring practices, consistently favors one racial group over another. It's not necessarily about overt acts of discrimination, though those certainly exist. It's about the subtle, often unseen biases that are built into the very machinery of the institution itself. Structural racism, on the other hand, is more about the larger societal forces at play. It's the societal norms, the cultural assumptions, the historical practices that have been woven into the very fabric of society. It's the invisible hand that guides the market, the silent voice that whispers in the ear of the decision-maker. It's the unseen, often unacknowledged force that shapes our world in ways that favor one racial group over another. Both institutional and structural racism are more than just the sum of individual acts of prejudice. They're like a river, formed by countless smaller streams, that carves a deep and powerful channel through the landscape of our society. They're the persistent and pervasive forces that shape our world and our lives in ways that are often difficult to see, let alone challenge. And that's why addressing racism requires more than just changing individual attitudes or behaviors. It's not enough to chop down the tree of racism. We must also uproot it. It's not enough to redirect the river of racism. We must also change its course. Addressing racism, therefore, requires systemic change. It requires us to examine, challenge, and ultimately transform the very systems and structures that sustain and perpetuate racism in our society. The impacts of racism extend beyond the individuals affected. It affects the entire society. It's a ripple effect that permeates every facet of our lives, from our social interactions to our economic prosperity and political landscape. Let's start with social division. Racism, in its essence, is a mechanism of division. It creates an us versus them mentality, breeding mistrust, fear, and hostility. It prevents us from seeing each other as fellow human beings, instead reducing us to labels and stereotypes. This division weakens the social fabric, making it harder for communities to work together, to empathize with each other, and to build a society that is inclusive and accepting of all. Moving on to economic inequality, racism fuels a cycle of poverty and disadvantage. It erects barriers to opportunities, denying certain groups access to quality education, decent jobs, and adequate healthcare. This systemic discrimination results in a wealth gap that persists across generations, hindering social mobility and perpetuating inequality. The economic cost of racism is staggering, and it's not just borne by the victims. Society as a whole pays the price in the form of wasted potential, lost productivity, and strained social services. Lastly, let's talk about political polarization. Racism can be used as a tool to stoke anger, fear, and resentment for political gain. It can deepen divisions, exacerbate conflicts, and undermine democratic values. It can distort public discourse, shift focus away from common issues, and hinder progress on important policy matters. The political impact of racism is profound, affecting not only the quality of governance but also the very nature of our democracy. In conclusion, racism is not a problem that affects only a subset of the population. It is a societal issue, one that touches every one of us, directly or indirectly. The effects of racism, therefore, are far-reaching and profound. Despite the challenge, there is a path forward, a path that is paved with the collective resolve of a society willing to learn, adapt, and grow. It's a path that requires us to acknowledge the painful past, while also committing to a future that promises equality and justice. Education plays a crucial role in this journey. By incorporating comprehensive and accurate historical accounts into our educational curriculum, we can foster a better understanding of the past. This understanding is the foundation for empathy, which can help us to dismantle stereotypes and prejudices. But education alone is not enough. We need to pair it with policy change. Policymakers have the power to influence the structure of our society and must be held accountable for ensuring that these structures promote racial equality. This includes everything from re-evaluating our criminal justice system to reforming housing policies, and even addressing wealth disparities that are rooted in racial discrimination. We also cannot discount the power of social activism. The voices of the people have the power to bring about change. Movements like Black Lives Matter have shown us the strength of collective action. We need to channel this energy towards working for a society where every person, regardless of their race, feels valued and respected. This path forward isn't easy. It's filled with difficult conversations, introspection, and the need for systemic change. It requires each one of us to not just be non-racist, but to be anti-racist, to actively challenge the status quo and to stand against racial discrimination in all its forms. The journey towards racial equality is long and challenging, but it is a journey worth taking. And as we take steps forward, let's remember that progress is not always linear. There may be setbacks, but they do not define our journey. They are simply reminders of the resilience we need to continue moving forward. Together, we can create a society where the color of one's skin does not dictate their opportunities or their worth. The journey towards racial equality is long and challenging, but it is a journey worth taking. The fight against racism is not just for the victims, it's a fight for all of us. And it's a fight that requires more than just understanding and empathy. It requires action. It requires us to not just stand against racism, but to actively dismantle it. So, how do we do that? Well, there are multiple ways we can contribute to this cause. First, we can educate ourselves, read books, watch documentaries, listen to podcasts, engage in dialogues, learn about the history, the struggles, the triumphs, and the ongoing battles of marginalized communities. And remember that education is continuous. It evolves, it grows. We must be willing to unlearn, to question, and to challenge our own biases. Second, let's use our platforms, no matter how big or small they might be. Speak up against racism when you see it. Challenge discriminatory jokes, stereotypes, and biases. Use your social media to share resources, to amplify voices, and to engage in constructive conversations about race. Third, let's support organizations that are working to combat racism. Donate if you can. Volunteer your time, share their work. These organizations are on the front lines of this battle, and they need all the support they can get. Fourth, vote. Vote for leaders who understand and acknowledge the systemic nature of racism. Leaders who are committed to implementing policies that promote equality and justice. Your vote is a powerful tool. Use it. Lastly, let's take care of ourselves and each other. This fight is long and arduous. It's filled with moments of despair, anger, and heartbreak. But it's also filled with moments of hope, resilience, and solidarity. Let's remember to validate each other's experiences, to listen, to offer comfort, and to stand together. Remember, the fight against racism is not a sprint. It's a marathon. It's a journey that we're all on together. It's a journey that requires patience, persistence, and perseverance. And it's a journey that we must be committed to, not just today, not just tomorrow, but every single day. Because at the end of the day, our fight against racism is more than just a fight for justice. It's a fight for humanity. It's a fight for a world where every individual is valued, respected, and treated equally, regardless of the color of their skin. So let's rise to this challenge. Let's use our voices, our platforms, our resources, and our votes to make a difference. Let's commit to being part of the solution, not just today, not just tomorrow, but every single day. In the fight against racism, every voice matters. What will your voice say?